Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as we are going to be now diving into some thoughts surrounding the NBA draft. It is just a couple days away now. The first round is on Wednesday the 26th. The second round is on Thursday the 27th. This is the first year that the NBA has decided to break up the draft day into two separate segments. A little bit of a weird concept to me. Definitely trying to go after the NFL draft sort of sequencing here. I think it's a little bit ridiculous, especially considering the reputation surrounding this draft in particular does sort of hurt the overall appeal of what we're going to see. But at the same time, you know, there's a good chance Bronny James is going to be hanging around when that second round arrives. So there are going to be things that will have content to talk about. But the latest sort of drama surrounding the number one overall pick is that the Hawks have supposedly been unable to get Alex Sarr in for a workout. Sarr, for, really specifically around when the lottery happened, Alex Sarr was seen as the favorite to be the number one overall pick. It was seen that way for a while, but Brian Windhorst and Jonathan Givony of ESPN reported that Sarr would actually prefer to play for the Wizards than with the Hawks, and that it's not quite a 2003 NFL draft situation where you have an Eli Manning who's going to refuse to play for one team in particular, but Sarr, who was seen as the number one overall prospect for a lot of this process, he is actively trying to avoid being drafted to Atlanta and end up in Washington. Now, he wouldn't refuse playing for Atlanta, but it's definitely a preferred landing spot, and I would have to imagine that is probably about having the opportunity for himself individually to be able to thrive, where Sarr is, if he ends up in Atlanta, he's playing with Trae Young and DeJounte Murray. The shots aren't necessarily his for the taking. He has to slide into a, third option type role. That's assuming that the Hawks do continue to move forward here with both Trae Young and DeJounte Murray, which it kind of sounds like that might be the case. Now, I've been on record in the past saying that I do believe that they need to shake up their roster of some sorts, but it's neither here nor there. If you are Sarr, you understand that it's probably the majority of Sarr's looks are going to be generated off of Trae Young action, which is nice sometimes. We saw in the past, even Clint Capella, who is definitely on a downwards trajectory at this point in his career, he largely benefited from having a James Harden as he was coming up as a big, and having Trae Young as well, where Harden, I would say more so than Young, did a tremendous job of getting him open looks at the rim, with him being a rim runner, throwing the lobs and such. And Sarr believes personally, as it feels like any NBA prospect should to some degree, feels like he can provide more than just that type of a role. And going to Washington, I mean, we know the current situation around the Wizards. Now, I do think that there are maybe a couple building blocks, the main one being Denny Avdia, who isn't really a number one option in his own right either. So Sarr would get a lot more opportunities in Washington to sort of establish himself during these rookie years, grow as a player, as opposed to being put in a pretty stagnant situation in Atlanta, where we know the Hawks are a mediocre team. Sometimes they look a little bit better, sometimes they look a little bit worse, but ultimately you figure they're going to end up around the 500 mark. And if you're not going to be ultra competitive anyways, Sarr wants to be in a position where he can actually thrive individually as a talent. Now, it's not that the Washington Wizards franchise is this, team organization that has been incredible at developing youth talent over the years, that they've been these great drafters or anything. But at the same time, again, you can't necessarily look at it from that perspective. you just have to think that Sarr is somebody who has been highly touted for the majority of his playing career. He was one of the biggest names in the Overtime Elite League when he played in America briefly in 2022, 23, one of those years before going back to France this past year. And now he is sort of come into this position where you still do have questions about some of the shooting upside, but there's at least an idea that on the ball he can be a little bit of an X factor in terms of what he can provide you offensively from that standpoint. And it wouldn't be bad for him, I think, by any means, to go out and just sort of, get those types of opportunities early on in his career. Ultimately, he's going to end up where he's going to end up, but it seems like he might be sliding a little bit more into the 2 spot as Donovan Clingan has continued to impress just about every team that he's worked out for up to this point, and especially with the reputation surrounding this year's draft in terms of we really don't know if there's going to be an all-NBA caliber star. You kind of have to, the way that it's been framed in a couple different ways is that it's almost like you have to imagine the number 1 overall pick this year is the number 7 overall pick in years prior, and Donovan Clingan is going to be a productive NBA player to some capacity in my analysis, where I think he does a ton right. We know about the defensive intensity, obviously drops off a little bit when he's on the perimeter, but still can hold his own to some degree. He is tremendous in the pick and roll. I think he has incredible hands, and sort of when I think about the idea of him being drafted number 1 overall, I go back to 2018 where DeAndre Ayton was taken number 1 overall, and he's been solid, I would say, up to this point. I don't think he's a bust necessarily, because he's a semi-productive, at times he's looked really good, but the issue is that you have the Luka Doncic's and the Trae Youngs being selected after him that make that pick look so much worse. And there's a number of other players in that 2018 draft as well. But again, if you're sort of cutting out the idea that there are these, especially with Luka, I still think it's one of the craziest things ever that the Suns didn't take him number 1 overall. They had, I'm blanking on his last name, it was Igor, whatever. He had actually coached Luka overseas. It was his first year in Phoenix. He easily could have, gave the Suns the intel needed to take him, but instead they go with Ayton, and the rest is sort of history there. But when I look at Clingan, I see no reason why he can't be just as successful as DeAndre Ayton, and maybe even have a little bit of a higher upside based off of the difference in motor that we've seen from Ayton throughout his young NBA career, and the way that we've seen Donovan Clingan and really all of those Huskies from last season be just grinders on the court of never really letting up. We've just seen these mental lapses with Ayton that I don't think are going to be the same in Clingan's game. So there really isn't much evidence to support the idea that Clingan can eventually be a stretch 5 in the NBA. Now, who knows, but when you look at the free throw shooting, typically a good indicator of, if there is any upside. Clingan just never even really attempted shots from the perimeter, so, we'll see whether or not that does ever come into play. I wouldn't count on it, but I also wouldn't let it hold me back if I am the Hawks in terms of trying to make a run here at Clingan, and that's anybody that needs a big man, especially, again, I mentioned, the Memphis Grizzlies, who are going to be at the top of the draft order. It's going to be, I would say, definitely out of range here, but if the Thunder were to be able to package some stuff and move up to get Donovan Clingan, I think that there are some really good fits there, and Clingan is somebody who can succeed in a lot of environments. Now, is he ever going to be a 20-point-per-game scorer? I wouldn't bank on it, but again, it's interesting when you combine this number 1 overall draft status in comparison to, this year as it is to years prior. I think you're just going to have to take it with a little bit of a grain of salt. But it definitely sounds like Clingan is moving up the boards, and he's been massively impressive in these workouts up to this point. And then the last report, I guess we're going a little bit big man heavy today, that I wanted to touch on was that the Ringer reported this morning that Zach Edey could be taken with the 7th overall pick to the Portland Trailblazers, which I find to be another very interesting situation. And you have to keep into perspective all the things we just talked about in terms of there very likely is not a superstar caliber player in this draft. Now, I still feel like for the Trailblazers, they have a lot of unknowns. Anthony Simons is a great guard. They have Scoot Henderson as well. So ideally, you think you have your backcourt of the future. But even there, some unknowns, probably more so with Scoot than there is with Simons, even though Simons' injuries are definitely becoming a little bit of an early theme of his career up to this point. You have a lot of openings on that team. And I do think that there are more impactful players than Edey that are going to be available at number 7. Now, Edey can probably carve out a role for himself. I don't think that, this idea that he has no skill, I don't subscribe to that. But I don't fully see how it translates to the NBA, and I would have hesitations there. Edey being a lottery pick, I can name 10 prospects that I like more than him, so I don't feel great about it. But again, you do have to understand that if there is a role that he can hold, even if it's talking about just somebody who can consistently be a backup big man for, a decade, that might be what you're shooting for here with the number 7 overall pick, considering that there is not a, top consensus tier of players who are going to be massively impactful. But we're going to definitely come to you with some mock drafts as the week goes on here. I just wanted to give some thoughts on the very latest buzz. But we do have an actual definitive trade that we have to dive into, where last week we saw Alex Caruso be traded for Josh Giddey as the Bulls and Thunder came to a deal. And I have some thoughts on it that I don't know necessarily if it's reflected by the general consensus in terms of whether or not the Bulls were fleeced. So we are going to be diving into that. But first, a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back.